Bird Observatory, and I direct the program across the Sierras, a bunch of different projects that we'll talk about here, so I won't go too much into it. And I'm based out of Chester, California, up here in the very, very, very top of the Sierras. Yeah, I think we'll just jump in here if we're all ready to go. So first I wanted to recognize my co-authors on this paper presentation, Nat Seavey and Diana Humble, both with PRBO, who've put in a lot of work in getting some of the data we're working on here together. So thank you to both of them. So what I'm going to talk about today is pretty much what it says there, using birds to guide and evaluate fuels treatments in the northern Sierra Nevada. And I think really this is applicable to most of the Sierra Nevada range, and probably elsewhere in conifer-based forest systems of the West. So I'm going to talk about 4 different things today. First, I'm going to give you a quick overview of PRBO. So I know we have a real diverse list of people there, and probably a lot don't even know what PRBO is. Then we'll jump into the bird response to fuels treatments on Forest Service land up here in the northern Sierra. And then we'll get into some discussion of enhancing fuels treatments or general forest thinnings to benefit birds and other wildlife. And then finally, some resources that are available to you from PRBO to help inform your decisions. Okay, so quick overview of PRBO. PRBO is a nonprofit organization. Our mission is to conserve birds and other wildlife and their ecosystems through innovative scientific research and outreach. We were founded in 1965 as the Point Reyes Bird Observatory, although our official name these days is PRBO Conservation Science, probably because you can see from that map on the right, we work a lot of other places than Point Reyes, especially in California. But we have over 120 staff and interns on an annual basis. We're based now out of Petaluma, California, in the North Bay. And we do a lot of research on especially common but also threatened species and kind of specialize in long-term studies. And we do take an ecosystem approach to our work, and we're dedicated to disseminating these research findings through all sorts of different avenues, such as what we're doing here today, and more formal stuff through peer review and other avenues. But also public outreach and education is a big part of our mission as well. So you can see here, this is a map showing PRBO study locations in California, and a large percentage of that really is the Sierra Nevada. So that's where our Sierra Nevada group is working, and you can see a real cluster up there in the top part, and that is up here in the northern Sierras, where I'll be talking mostly about our data from there today. So PRBO Sierra Nevada group or program really is focused on Forest Service land, though recently we've expanded more to private land, especially related to meadows, and then also some post-fire work we've been doing up here in collaboration with folks like Mike De La Soe. But we're really focused on effectiveness monitoring bird response to different types of treatments, different types of management strategies, and feeding that information back in a kind of adaptive management framework to improve conservation outcomes for birds and other wildlife. And so here's some just examples of some of the things we're doing: post-fire habitat, fuels treatments, which we're talking about today, aspen restoration, meadows, and then a recent, in the last couple of years, a range-wide, kind of exciting range-wide bioregional monitoring of birds on national forest lands that will hopefully reap all sorts of benefits in the long term with having that kind of data set. Okay, so kind of moving into the second section here, we're going to talk about a recent analysis we completed on a study we're doing up here in the northern Sierra, and some of you are familiar with the Quincy Library Group area of the northern Sierra, which is the Plumas, Lassen, and the just a small portion of the Tahoe, one ranger district on the Tahoe National Forest. And this analysis we did, we took 122 bird point count stations that were in mechanical commercial timber harvest as part of a defensible fuel profile zone, shaded fuel breaks. And we took 122 of our point count stations that were in those areas from data collected from 2004 to 2010, again on the Lassen and Plumas, and we have both pre- and post-treatment data for these sites with up to 5 years of post-treatment data. So we really are talking about more of the short-term responses to treatments here than maybe stuff that might manifest over much longer term, 10, 20 years. And we selected reference sites surrounding these areas for each of the treated sites. And we investigated a total of 14 species in this analysis, and then overall species richness of all species that were adequately sampled using our point count methods. So here's a kind of general map of the study area. I'm going to try to use this pointer here. So here, orient ourselves. What did I do? Oh, Lassen National Park is this white area here. This is Lake Almanor. I'm sitting right there right now. And so each one of these dots is one of the study sites, and within each one of those dots there are multiple bird survey stations. And so you can see it's more or less the west slope, as much as we have a west slope up here of the Sierras. Mixed conifer forest is where we did this study. So ideally, when we started the study, we had this nice replicated before-after control impact study set up. And then reality set in, and the Forest Service tries to implement these treatments, and we're dependent upon everything from lawsuits to the timber market to managers' ability to finish NEPA in time to get these treatments implemented. So it ends up a little messier than you originally hoped, especially just sitting here in the science perspective. So you can see this schematic kind of shows you what we had to deal with. So we had these treatments that went in. Our bird data had different number of years of pre-treatment data for sites. So sometimes we'd have up to 4 years of pre-treatment data. Sometimes we'd only have 1. And then the number of years we had post-treatment data totally varied. And so a site that was, as you can see from the schematic, a site that was 4 years post-treatment in 1 year, another site might be 3 versus 1 versus some other number. And therefore, we know there's a lot of annual variation in bird indices up here. And so we needed to control for some of those things. So in our model, we included random effects of site, station, and year, and then to help kind of filter out that heterogeneity in our data set. And so here's what our model looked like. We used a generalized linear model with a Poisson distribution. Just means our data was kind of zero skewed. There's a lot more places where there were no birds detected than you'd expect. And then we use those year, site, and station as random effects to account for that spatial and temporal variability. And then we use detections of birds per point, raw detections of birds per point within 50 meters of observers as the dependent variable. And we use the R statistical package to do our analysis. And then we generated 95% confidence intervals as well as 90% confidence intervals. So we're going to take our first pause here and make sure everyone's up to speed and take any questions. I don't see anything in the queue. So Richard, I don't know if you want to tell me how long we want to wait here.
So if you do have any questions for this initial segment here, just put them in the chat box, and if they're, can be addressed in a couple of minutes here, well, then we'll do that.
Yeah, and you'll see my pauses here. I threw in just some random photos of birds I've taken around the world, so give us something other than...
What is that bird that we're looking at?
It's an azure kingfisher from northern Australia.
Interesting. Well, I don't see any questions, so I think we can move on. Everybody should be on this slide in terms of internet speed. Everybody should be on the pause for questions slide by now.
Right. If you're not seeing a bird that has no business being in a presentation about the Sierra Nevadas, you're in the right place.
Okay, Ryan, why don't you move on then?
Okay. So what effects would we predict? We decided to look at these, since we're looking at a whole host of species here, we wanted to look and see, we want to try to see if we could group these into smaller compartments and look at them kind of as a whole, to see what they would tell us about what was happening in the forest. And so we kind of put them into 3 general habitat association guilds. Birds associated with mature closed canopy forest, those associated with understory shrub component, and then those that were more associated with forest edges, openings in the overstory, as well as more open ground. And so those are the three kind of groups, and we're going to go through the data here and clumped into these groups. So the first group were birds associated with the mature closed canopy forest. And as you might expect, we predicted these were the birds that might show a negative response to the treatments, because these treatments are more or less removing overstory, thinning out the forest. They're going from maybe 70, 80% canopy cover down to 40. That was often the target number. So these are the species we thought, overstory foliage volume is probably being reduced. That's where these species mostly forage. So we thought they'd decline. So we looked at these 5 species, and you can see here just an overview of the results that we really didn't find that. We had 2 species that showed some evidence of a negative effect of the treatments. 2 had really no effect shown, and 1 actually, brown creeper, who often is thought of as a kind of a late cereal species, actually showed a pretty clear sign of increasing. So we're going to go through some data here, some slides, and we'll go through them somewhat quickly, but the slides are, the graphs are all the same. So I just want to give you guys a quick, hopefully this is going to work. Yeah. So you can see in each one of these bars you're looking at, the dots are the mean, the thick bars represent the 90% confidence interval, and then the thinner bars coming off the end of those go out to the 95% confidence limits. And then you can see we have both the green bar on the left is our untreated sample, so that's the reference site for all years combined there. And then we have the treatment sites before they were treated, the mean for those next to that in blue. And so those dots coming across the lines are just bringing that mean across, so you can kind of see as we go time since treatment how the each year relates to that level. And so basically, instead of taking a real strong yes, no, 95% confidence interval approach to this, we really wanted to look a little more closely at the data. That's what's kind of nice about graphing it here, and see, well, maybe they're not representing 95% confidence interval significance, but obviously there may be some effect. So our first species here, golden crown kinglet, this is a species for which we suggest there is a pretty good signal that they have decreased following treatment. You can see their levels in each of the 5 years post-treatment are well below the mean before treatment, and in at least 3 of those years at the 90% confidence interval, it is significantly lower. So we think that's a pretty good evidence that that species showed some decline from these treatments. All right, so hermit warbler, next species, and this is one of our, maybe these 2 first species are probably our most prototypical, dense overstory foliage species. And again, this species not quite as strong as for golden crown kinglet, but there looks like there's some evidence of a decline. Certainly their abundance has never reached the same level it was before treatment, though in no one year were those significantly different than the mean before treatment. And the magnitude difference here for hermit warbler not so big. So some evidence of decline, but certainly not a strong decline. The next one, red-breasted nuthatch, even less of an effect here. It looks like quite a bit of variation year to year in their abundance, and most of those numbers are hugging right close to the mean of both the untreated sample and the pre-treatment. So really, I think clear to say no effect from detected here for nuthatch. And then Hammond's flycatcher. And this is a species often associated with dense forest, but flycatches out from openings in the canopy, so maybe actually use some more openings than we might suspect. But again, real no effect here. A lot of annual variation or some annual variation, and most of the numbers well within the confidence limits. And then finally, the last mature closed canopy species, brown creeper. Pretty clear signal here that brown creepers have increased following treatments. In fact, in most years, the numbers almost doubled what they were pre-treatment levels, and it looks like it took a little lag there in time before they started responding, but a pretty good sign that this species has increased after the treatments. So, moving on to shrub-dependent species here. Well, our prediction for shrub birds was that these treatments that removed overstory might bring about shrub regeneration in the understory with more light, shrub regeneration, shrub sprouting. but that initially just the compaction or the movement of mechanical equipment over the surface would probably break up a lot of the shrub layer, and in a lot of places they actually remove shrubs as part of the treatment to remove ladder fuels. So we predicted that maybe these species would show an initial short-term negative response, which then maybe out is 4 to 5 years, as far out as our data goes here, we might start to see a positive response. And see the overview here is really didn't see much of a response from any of the species. Maybe dusky flycatcher, as you'll see here, had a little bit of that response that we were predicting. So here is dusky flycatcher. So a pretty good sign that there was a decline, a decrease immediately following treatment for them. And then there certainly looks like there's a trend going there where their numbers are increasing. In the last 2 years, they're above the levels they were before treatment. So some sign that effect is happening. Maybe shrubs are starting to regenerate in some places in here. And this is a species we actually think we find them nesting in the understory of conifer forest in rather small shrub patches. So that makes sense that this might be the species to show that response. So the next species is fox sparrows, prototypical open shrub field species. Pretty large error bars around their estimates, and maybe some signal that they're starting to increase after treatment, but we said that was no effect. The error bars are pretty large and overlapping. The confidence intervals are overlapping there. The next one, Nashville warbler, associated with shrubs, but also often with like young regenerating black oak, and really no sign of an effect for them. And then another understory shrub species, McGilvery's warbler, which almost showing maybe the opposite effect that we were predicting. Some sign that there might have been a slight increase after treatment, but what looked like to be a negative trend in the following years, which is really interesting. I'm not sure how to interpret that. And I think all these graphs are showing us that another 5 years would be very interesting to see what happens. Okay, so I think we've hit our second pause for questions here. We're still in Australia here and New South Wales now. Let's go in. Would be most likely to increase because they're going to create more openings in the canopy. They'd be creating potentially edges and certainly more open ground than was there before by removing those surface and ladder fuels out of the stands. And so those 5 species are olive-sided flycatcher, western tanager, chipping sparrow, dark-eyed junco, and yellow-rump warbler. And as you can see, here's where we found more effects. And they were generally positive. So going through here, olive-sided flycatcher, pretty clear signal there that they're increasing after treatment. I think that's the one that actually was significant in most years. Western tanager, some sign of increase, but certainly there's some variation going on there. So we kind of left that as tentative, but maybe some sign. Certainly the mean was above the mean before treatment or untreated in almost all years after treatment. Chipping sparrow, we said this was no effect. Some years it looked like we were headed in the right direction there, increasing, and then in the 5 year after treatment data set, something else happened. So again, another reason to keep following some of these species further out since treatment occurs, because it's certainly not plateauing. Dark-eyed junco, pretty good sign there that they're increasing. Most of those are overlapping the mean, but again, well above the mean in all years after treatment, the pretreatment mean, and significant in a couple of those years. And yellow rump warbler, less certain, but maybe some indication that they're increasing. That was one of the few species where our untreated control sites and our pretreatment varied quite a bit. They were close to significantly different, which is not what we wanted to see. For all the other species you saw, those two means were often very close together. So that kind of complicates interpretation of this species, but some evidence that they might be increasing. And this is an interesting warbler because they do a lot of fly catching. So that makes sense that they might benefit from opening up of the overstory. And then overall species richness. So this is looking at about 80 species that our sampling technique adequately samples. And as you can see, we may get some increases in some species, decreases in others. The magnitude of those differences didn't seem very large. And then when you compare all the species together, it's more or less a wash, that we may decline a few, increase a few, and they're not having any significant effects on species richness. So going back to our predictions there, we always got to check ourselves when we make these bold predictions. So did the conifer tree species, mature overstory species increase, or excuse me, decrease? Not consistently for sure. 2 of the species showed an effect. One of them really was significant. The other one was marginal. Did shrub species decrease and then increase? No, none of the species showed an increase or decrease, and then only one species showed a subsequent increase. And then birds associated with forest edges, that's where we saw the biggest effects, and it looks like 4 of the 5 species are showing some evidence of increasing in the first 5 years after treatment. Treatment should be thinking about how we benefit more of these shrub-dependent species.
Okay, we can move on then to the next portion of the presentation.
Okay, so we're going to start talking about how can we enhance these treatments to increase benefits to birds? Because some might say, like Richard was saying, well, maybe these treatments aren't a problem. They sound like they're fine. They're not having any real negative effects on that many species of birds. Let's just keep doing what we're doing. And that's where we would argue that when we start thinking about the whole of the system, the disturbance regimes, and how we're managing, especially on national forest land, is that within these fuel reduction treatments, we see an opportunity to benefit a whole suite of species that may not be being managed for otherwise. So we have done a previous analysis with the same data set, and where it's kind of a preliminary analysis. We changed our whole technique here, so I didn't present a lot of that, but we actually looked at all 4 different types of treatments. This mechanical overstory, group selections, which were half-acre to 2-acre basic clear cuts, and then a pre-commercial / mastication, where basically non-merchantable understory trees and shrubs were cut or masticated with that machine over there on the right, bottom right, and then prescribed fire. And so really what I wanted to point out here, and this gets to what we were just talking to there a minute ago, is that we saw this huge difference between pre-commercial mastication, and that's mechanical treatment, with 1 bird showing a positive response to that. It was all a flycatcher, and 6 showing negative. And then versus prescribed fire, 6 showing positive and 1 showing negative. And just the stark contrast between those 2 types of treatments, the more natural disturbance regime to the system versus mechanical removal of stuff. And you can see down on there on the bottom, we have a picture of a prescribed fire on the Alaska National Forest in a shrub field, and then a masticator. And I think the real difference going on there is that masticators don't cut mosaics into the shrubs and take some of them and leave some of them and then release nutrients that create really fast regeneration. They take it all. And so you can see on the right there, there's a site that used to be a big shrub field. It was a long-term study plot of ours where we were studying fox bears and dusky flycatchers, and there aren't any more of those on that site after the mastication. Whereas on the left, a fire like that, and that was a spring fire. You can see the snow, so it probably killed some birds when it got implemented, but it burned in a mosaic pattern. It did not burn up the whole shrub field. It resulted in natural regeneration. We went out there, I remember, the year after the fire, and we were looking at manzanita, thinking they were aspen at first because the leaves were so large and lush. So really a big difference between those 2 types of treatments, and something to consider. And I'll talk more and more about the importance of fire as a fuel reduction tool and as part of shaping the landscape in the Sierra for birds. So I wanted to talk a little bit more. So we looked at all these different species, and we saw a couple species declining, a few species increasing, and some just kind of neutral. And really, when we take this community-wide approach, instead of looking at single species, we're looking at a whole diverse suite of species that represent different components of the ecosystem, different habitat types. What we're finding is what you probably would expect, that all these species are occupying different components of the ecosystem. And so if we're going to manage the Sierra Nevadas for biodiversity, and specifically bird biodiversity, we've got to do that by managing for a range of habitat types and conditions. So for an example here, just looking up here at the top left graph, we can see a species like all-sided flycatcher here, which is OSFL, is showing this increase in when the amount of edge within a landscape 1 kilometer of its where they occur or of a site increases up over 50-60%, their numbers start to really increase. And a similar kind of pattern for dusky flycatchers as well, another shrub nesting birds. Whereas hermit warblers, HEWA here, have the complete opposite effect. So if we're out there managing for all-sided flycatchers, which we saw responded positively to DFPZs, we're probably going to have a negative effect on hermit warblers. So how do we balance that? And to sum that up quickly, different strokes for different folks. So really the answer, I think, is homogenization of habitat. Or not the answer, but homogenization of the habitat is going to result in a loss of biodiversity and bird species. So again, these are looking at just the same kind of stuff, more landscape level predictors of bird species abundance. And you can see these graphs. Really, instead of trying to figure out what these graphs are saying, just notice that the contrast in some of these variables, like the amount of hardwood cover. We know hardwood cover is really invaluable for a species like Nashville warbler. Over here, this guy, there's his response to hardwood cover. Just keep giving me more of it. Really associated strongly with black oak. Whereas species, again, like hermit warbler, not so much. And so we really got to consider how we balance these things in a landscape level approach to fuels treatments or management as a whole in the Sierra Nevada. Because if we don't, we're going to homogenize the system and we're going to leave many species out in the rain. So this is an analysis we did a few years back in the same study area where we compared bird abundance inside and outside of spotted owl home range core areas, which is a Forest Service designation to set aside 1,000 acres of the, quote, best habitat surrounding known spotted owl nest or, if nest can't be found, roost sites. And so we did this analysis, compared this 25 species of birds, the 20 most abundant land bird species, and then 5 species that were rare or declining, and compared their abundance inside and outside of these core areas that have been designated by the Forest Service to be kind of no treatments were going to go in these areas as part of the Sierra Nevada Forest Plan. They're set aside for spotted owls. I think they can hand thin in them, but there's not going to be any of these DFPZs. There's not going to be large treatments going in. And so what we found here is that the umbrella afforded by spotted owls is rather minimal. So these species here on this side of the dividing line, these guys are those species that are more abundant inside of spotted owl habitat. And you can see the magnitude of the effect, the regression coefficients being 0.5, the slope of those lines, are rather small compared to some of these species over on the other side, left out in the rain, were negative 1.5. So some of these species, and look at the familiar names, there's these shrub birds, fox sparrow, calliope, hummingbird, spotted towhee, interesting Cassin's finch, which we think is associated with grass in the understory, leaves a lot of seeds. There's our edge specialist, all-sided flycatcher, dusky flycatcher, wood pewee, etc. So a lot of the shrub nesting birds. And then one more interesting thing, the Shannon Index of Diversity right there, also, bird diversity is significantly lower in spotted owl protected areas than it is outside of them. So I think that just drives home the point that we have to take this more balanced approach to managing for multiple ecosystem components and not just consider single species approaches. And so we are setting aside a lot of habitat for owls, rightfully so, in the Sierra Nevada, but at the same time, we need to consider other species. So, and why do we need to consider other species? The elephant in the room in every Sierra Nevada ecology talk, right, is fire suppression. We've suppressed the fire. So what does that mean? And we've talked about how fire is increasing recently in the Sierra Nevadas, and there's no doubt that there's a signal it's been increasing in the last couple decades. Fire's size is getting larger. Severity is increasing. But the fact of the matter remains is that we're still burning 90% fewer acres burned in the Sierra Nevada every year than historically did. And so a lot of our policies towards forest management, I think, are driven by this misperception of the importance of fire. There's no question fire is the primary disturbance regime, ecological disturbance regime in the Sierra Nevada, and has shaped the Sierra Nevada that we see today, that and its recent suppression. And so, we're really working on a lot of projects up here in the Northern Sierra, especially one specifically focused on post-fire habitat, looking at bird response to it, and bird response to different treatments that the Forest Service is putting in. And I just point out this, this is me kind of riling some feathers, this old Forest Service poster with Smokey the Bear that says, thanks to you, we still have a home, and it shows all these bird species. And it's just fun to point out that species like this rufous hummingbird in the Sierra Nevada, where we find them most abundant, in high-severity fire. Indigo bunting, its sibling species in the Sierra Nevada, elasuli bunting, reaches its greatest abundance in high-severity fire. Bluebird, eastern bluebird on this guy, our western bluebird and mountain bluebirds reach the greatest abundance in the Sierra Nevada. You got it, in high-severity fire. Spotted towhee up here, well, this is the rufous-sided towhee, but spotted towhee, actually is a spotted towhee, reaches its greatest abundance in the Sierra Nevada in high-severity fire. So goldfinches in the Sierra Nevada, most abundant in fire. The only place we know cedar waxwings are breeding in the higher elevations of the Sierra Nevada, high-severity fire. So there's some misinformation out there about fire, and I just throw that out there now to, well, I can't not talk about it, but in the context when we're thinking about fuels treatments and managing of the ecosystem, we consider the importance of fire in the Sierra, and fire of all severities, because there's no question if you're looking at birds, high severity, moderate severity fire are important. So open forest and shrub limiting factors in the Sierra. We really think that there is a signal out there that some of the birds associated with open forest and shrub habitats are showing some declines. Species like Cassin's finch, species like chipping sparrow, rufous hummingbird, olive-sided flycatcher, even common species like American robin have shown declines in the Sierra Nevada in the last 30 or 40 years. And so we really want to look at, well, what might be causing that? Are we actually losing open forest habitats in the Sierra? And so we've kind of thrown out these ideas of, well, we've suppressed fire, 90% reduction in the area burned. 50% of the national forest in our study area up here in the northern Sierra is in areas set aside for either spotted owls or goshawks or off-basin deferred. It's a QLG designation. About half of the whole forest up here is basically in untouched areas. So with the current trajectory in fire suppression, we know where they're headed, towards closed canopy. Fuel reduction treatments that are implemented on Forest Service land generally retain 40 to 60% canopy cover. That's kind of a spotted owl idea coming from Werner's work down in the southern Sierra, looking at radio telemetry birds, showing that they were avoiding areas with less than 40% canopy cover. So generally DFPZs remain high canopy. And many fuel projects actually are targeting shrub areas. So when we looked at all of our data from all treatments they were putting in, we saw the strong signal that they're putting in these treatments in areas that tend to be earlier cereal habitat. One, because maybe those are the areas that have been choked out. But two, those are also the areas that are available to them, because a lot of 50% of the forest is basically off base to them, and that's a lot of the older cereal forest. And then, we think of private land potentially providing for this early cereal habitat, but for the most part, they inhibit broadleaf regeneration through pre-emergent herbicides or regular treatments. And then, so maybe post-fire habitat is our best opportunity to generate these early cereal habitats, but we also have, the push to intensively manage post-fire habitat, especially if that's the case on private land. So people often ask me, so you're saying chop up the forest and create all this open habitat, aren't you going to fragment the forest? And I think it's important to think about the difference between habitat fragmentation. I stole this from Jerry Franklin, by the way. Habitat fragmentation versus habitat heterogeneity. And in the western forest here, that the habitat fragmentation paradigm doesn't hold very well. In fact, we find a much stronger signal from birds being positively associated with habitat edges and habitat heterogeneity versus any of the species that might show a negative response. And so here is our archetypal edge species, the olive-sided flycatcher. And again, that's that same graph I showed earlier, showing that they really do increase as the amount of edge, strong edge, that's edge between, say, forest and shrub field or forest and meadow, increases their abundance. 50% of the landscape around where they want to be is in that habitat type of edge. They really go up. So why should we manage for shrub habitats in the Sierra Nevada? Isn't shrub land just brush and a pain in the butt? And isn't the Sierra really all about its conifer forest? And that's where all the birds are nesting and the biodiversity occurs. And the answer to that is No. You know, at least 20-25% of the birds that nest in the Sierra Nevada nest in or below shrubs, and a much larger percentage of the birds utilize shrubs for some portion of their life cycle. For instance, calliope hummingbirds nest in trees, but are totally dependent upon broadleaf shrubs for nectar source, things like ribes. And then even species like hermit thrush, a deep forest bird, we regularly see them this time of year out in shrub fields eating, whether it be coffee berries or currants or whatever it is, utilizing those angiosperms in the gymnosperm world, I think is the way to put it. So fox sparrow, again, our archetypal shrub bird. They need not only large patches, or not only dense patches of shrubs, as you can see here, their abundance related to shrub cover really goes up. We recommend you manage patches of shrub for over 40% shrub cover for this species. But they not only need dense shrub cover, they need, I don't know how well you guys can all see this, they need large areas. So this is the fox sparrow abundance as related to the amount of shrub habitat within 500-meter radius. And really, once you get over about 20% of the landscape within 500 meters of them in shrubs, their abundance really starts to increase. So they're not only using dense shrub, they're using rather large patches, and we recommend managing for them for between 10 and 200-acre shrub habitat patches. And group selections, they're going in and the Forest Service are often half an acre to 2 acres, and really they're just not going to provide the habitat for this species whose mean territory size is 2 to 3 acres. So I think it comes down to this. We're not saying that shrub habitats are the most important thing and we got to nuke all the mature forest. It really is managing for the mosaics in what we call the conifer sea, managing for hardwoods like aspen and black oak, managing for montane chaparral, meadows, clearly important, and also post-fire habitat. It's part of the mosaic. It's critical. We know there's species like blackback woodpeckers that reach their greatest abundance in this habitat, things like lazuli buntings as well, the bluebirds, a whole host of species that are far more abundant in these post-fire areas than they will be in anything that we ever create mechanically. So jumping into some management recommendations that we've made, kind of the broad general one is as much as possible when we're implementing these. Obviously, we have a short window up here. We can't usually operate over snow with these fuel treatments, but avoiding disturbing breeding bird habitat during the breeding season and limiting stuff to August through April as much as possible would certainly benefit or avoid taking a lot of these species out while they're nesting. But just the general perception of recognizing that early successional habitats are an important component of the ecosystem here. And without them, we will lose a significant portion of our biological diversity, and probably more than we even think. Some of those late serial species are probably more dependent on early successional habitats for prey or whatever than we think they are. And really pushing for habitat and structural diversity. We didn't talk too much about this today, but really designing these fuel treatments in a mosaic approach that creates openings surrounded by denser patches. So you could maybe maintain 40% canopy cover across the whole stand, but doing it in a patch-like pattern is going to invigorate understory species while also creating dense patches for things like the hermit warbler. So we may be able to have benefits for the majority of species that we analyze in these treatments versus having no effect to some negative and a few positives. And then we didn't talk today about woodpeckers. Some of our data, our methodology isn't very good for detecting woodpeckers. So that is one caveat to throw in there. Obviously, that we know there's major snag reduction in a lot of these fuel treatments, whether they try to or not, hazard tree removal, et cetera. So managing for large quantities of snags where possible, a lot of places there aren't, is valuable, and not just thinking in terms of nest trees for these cavity nesting birds, but they're foraging on these trees as well. And so think about the next generation of snags. Those dying trees are super valuable for woodpeckers and other bark foraging birds, not just for cavities, but for foraging. And designing fuel treatments, again, I think I covered this with mosaic pattern to invigorate shrubs and herbaceous layer in our hardwoods. We often forget about the importance of herbaceous layer in the Sierra Nevada, but certainly it's an important seed source, nectar source for birds. And this is one that gets somewhat controversial with folks, is consider, if we're going to create openings like group selections, that maybe we should consider, instead of peppering the landscape with them, might we consider making fewer of them, but making them larger, and put these into those really choked out mid-cirral stands that aren't supporting much biodiversity at all. And then also consider thinning below 40% in some places where it would be appropriate, creating shelter woods that have a tree component but enough light reaching the understory to invigorate a dense shrub layer. And if those two are separated far enough, I don't think there's a ladder fuel issue, especially if the shrubs are maintained regularly through fire. And that really is, I think, the thing we have to keep pushing here: fire, fire, fire. These treatments, I think, would benefit greatly from following mechanical with prescribed fire. And then the talk of that we're going to put enough of these treatments on the landscape that we're eventually going to let fire go back to somewhat of a natural ecosystem component. It sounds far-fetched to me, but I think we have to keep pushing for that. We know fire is the dominant disturbance regime in the Sierra Nevada. We wouldn't think that we could replace riparian flooding by disking a field and every 3 years, and we do the natural process that way. So why would we think that we can just mechanically treat and we can completely mimic the natural process? We got to use fire in as many ways as we possibly can in the Sierra. There's clear signals with a lot of these species, and that's just a few of the recommendations. We have dozens more that can be gained through our reports by either contacting me, or you can visit our Sierra Nevada Avian Monitoring Information Network. Under the sample design for each of those nodes, you'll see on there there are reports that you can access that have lots more recommendations for managing all sorts of things, from aspen habitat to post-fire to fuels treatments. And here's a plug for our that Avian Monitoring Information Network. It's an interactive tool for you to use to access reports and publications and other literature, actually download our raw data. We're making that available to folks, both our survey locations and results. You can view just where our study locations are on a map. If you're working for the Forest Service and designing a project, you can see, do we have data on fox sparrows or mountain quail, whatever it is you're looking for from your study area? There's a pretty good chance we do. So I definitely suggest you guys check that out. And there's the link there. It'll be on the last page as well. And we also have on there white papers we put together, kind of a general overview for managing some of these habitats. We're working on one for post-fire right now, but we have them for managing for shrub habitats, mixed conifer, hardwood, aspen, and meadows. And we're going to do a fire one and then maybe a snag one as well here in the next few months. So finally, I want to thank our funders. The work we've done up here for the last 10 years has been funded by the Quincy Library Group Monitoring Program, the National Fire Plan, the Lassen and Plumas National Forest, Pacific Southwest Research Station of the Forest Service out of Davis, the Resource Legacy Fund, and the Morgan Family Foundation. And some specific folks I want to thank, especially folks like Peter Stein and Colin Dillingham and the folks on Lassen National Forest, all our field biologists, and then folks that have helped us with photos. Brenda McGarry, an aspiring journalist who worked for us the last couple of years, has given us some of those great pictures we saw today. So again, if you more questions or information that we don't cover today,